Come and you will see. The first reading and the gospel today are part of what's known as a call narrative, part of a genre where the prophets or the disciples received a call from God and they learned to follow him. Inside these two, one for Samuel, today the prophet, the second last of the prophets, or the last of the prophets, and then the one, of course, with the new disciples, Andrew and Peter. We hear this call, but they come in slightly two different ways, and it raises some really good questions for us to answer. The first question is, do we expect God to talk to us? Do we expect to hear, or is that just exclusively for the disciples or prophets? And I'll answer. The second question is then if we do expect God to speak to us, who do we listen to that helps us become a better listener to God? Who is our mentor in listening to God? And then the third question that raises up is how do we listen? What does that look like? So let's dive into this, because I think it's going to be pretty interesting. The first one is do we expect God to speak to us? And I mean, you've heard me speak of this over and over again, is God is always in communication with us. If we're not hearing God, it's either God is silently present to us or we're not hearing what God has to say. So God is, and that's not just for priests or prophets or kings, it's for every single one of us. God is calling us to newness of life, calling us into a loving relationship, not only with him, but with each other, always, and is guiding us. Now, and I've spoken before about what does that look like, and that's prayer, and I'll come back to that in the last question. How do we open ourselves to that prayer? But first of all, is that we have to understand God is speaking to us. We have to have that expectation, because if we don't have that expectation, then we won't even begin to listen. Right? I mean, so that's the premise with which we all need to operate. Now, I know some of us might find it harder than others, and that's okay. We get better at it. But the presumption is God is always speaking to us. So hold on to that. Now the question is, who helps us? Who helps us listen? In today's readings, we have the prophet Samuel is under the apprenticeship of his master Eli. And Eli is helping him learning to listen to God's voice in his life. And in the gospel, we have the disciples who are first listening to John, and John is pointing the way to the Lamb of God. He says, look, there's the Lamb of God. Listen to him. So the question then for us is this, and it's a really important question. To whom do we listen to in our lives? To whom do we listen to in our lives? In other words, who do we give that extra edge of influence with whom we are willing to listen to? Now, I suppose with children, we expect it to be our parents. But do we listen to them? Do we listen to our parents? I mean, we might presume that to be true, but in fact, young people today, there's a real challenge for you, is that there's a temptation to listen to social media as and they're called that for a reason, influencers for a reason, because they're there to influence you. Now, the question I have, and I'm not going to question the teenagers here or the young people here to say, should you be listening to that? All I'm saying is, are they leading you to God? Are they leading you to being a better person? Or after watching or listening to social media or whoever it is we listen to, are we closer to Christ or are we further away? Are we a better person or a lesser person? My fear is now, and that's not only for the young people, that also has to be a question for us. To whom do we listen to? Like, who is our influences? To what television shows do we give our time? To what newscasters do we listen to? To what politicians do we listen to? To what influencers what authors are we reading? Because let's be very clear, they are influencing us. So to whoever we are reading or listening, whether that be a podcast, a YouTube, or a TikTok video, or whether that be an author or a sophisticated politician, if there's one in the world, they are influencing us. And the question are they helping us to become better humans? Now, here, we want to be not just better humans, we want to be better Christians. Right? So we have to be very careful. So that's I can't answer that question for you. You have to ask that question, to whom am I listening to? And with how much influence do I give to them? Because I think we need to curate some people in our lives who help us listen to God in our life. That's more than likely not going to come from a television. It's not going to come from a newscaster. Why? Because that's not how they are. They're not going to be, that's not how it works. They're for money. It's a money proposition. Right? And influencers on social media, not much different. So whom we listen? Now, we could listen to our spouse, but do we really listen to our spouse? Do we really listen to our children? Do we really listen to our parents? Do we have some person in our life who is a good soul who influences us to listen to God so that we can hear that call? An Eli in our life who will guide us and say, God is speaking to you. Just say, speak. Your servant is listening. Now, which brings me to the third and final part, is with how do we listen to the voice? First of all, the premise was that God is speaking. So now the question is, how do we listen to ourselves? Because it can't be just about influencers. We have to be willing to do the hard work ourselves to learn to listen to God in our own heart, because he is speaking to every single one of us. Other people can influence us and help us, but we need to own that job. That's called prayer, my friends. And if you haven't heard me talk about prayer right now, you haven't been listening. Right? Prayer is critical in our lives. Now, there are a couple of things that are going to help us here, and I said this to students on Wednesday, and it's worth repeating. There are two things that are super important. There's an interior listening or preparation, and there's an exterior one. Let's talk about the exterior one, which is pretty easy. If I'm in a noisy room and I'm trying to listen to you, that's pretty hard to do. So there's an exterior noise. If we're really wanting to pray, then we've got to find a quiet place, physically secluded away. So it's very hard with the television on, the radio on, all those things on. It's going to be very hard with exterior noise to come to the Lord. Now, where can you have that? You got lots of places you can go. You can have a quiet place in your garden, quiet place in nature, quiet place in your room. The car without the radio is just fine. It doesn't matter where, but we need to decrease the exterior noise to help us. The second part is the interior. This is a little hard work, and this is where we need to put the work in. We need to quieten our exterior, and then we need to quieten the interior. And what are we listening for? Again, the premise is we're listening for the voice of God guiding us to our better selves, to the better version of ourselves, to the better Christian, to the soul that we were created. And what we can do here is, this is where we need to do some work, is learning to steady and slow our soul down to just be with the Lord, and to learn to listen for his voice, and to be able to say what Samuel says, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." Would you see how much work we've got to do on this? We've got some work to do, my friends, because the busyness of our lives, with the amount of inputs that we're getting, it's hard to sort it all out. But there's a framework. Presume that Christ is speaking to us in our hearts. Look at who is our influencers and helping us become a Christian. And then still the exterior and the interior noise, so that we can, in fact, listen. Can then make our prayer, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening."